Hello. I'm here to talk about Katello and the new data modeling with Pulp 3 and how what the changes we're making mean and what it looks like in the various scenarios. Reviewing our current model in Katello, when you create a repository, it creates a repository object in addition to a root repository object. And you see here in the middle we have our Katello repository objects in the table. And I've simplified the columns to just be ID and Pulp ID. So all I'm showing here is that for every repository in Katello, we create one repository in Pulp. When we publish a content view, we're going to generate an archive instance of that repository as well as an instance in the lifecycle environment. So all I'm showing here is that you have 3 repositories in Katello. That means 3 repositories in Pulp 2. The Pulp 3 model is vastly different, and there's never a one-to-one correlation between really anything in Katello to anything in Pulp 3. Reviewing the Pulp 3 terminology, a repository is just a set of version contents. It has many versions. Anytime you sync or add or remove content from the repository, it generates a new version. A remote is an object that you can create that tells Pulp how to sync from a remote resource, such as syncing a Yum repo. A repository version, I would say a remote is kind of similar to an importer in Pulp 2. A repository version, as I said, is a sort of the snapshot of the content units in the repository. So there are many repository versions in a repository, and it sort of increments forward. A publisher is an object that you create that knows how to take a repository version and generate metadata, such as Yum metadata for a Yum repo. However, and so that generates a publication. However, a publication is not accessible to the user or to a system or to software. It's really not exposed at all. You need to create a distribution to do that. So a distribution would be like a path that it would be exposed at on a web server or on the web server. Or for example, for Docker, it would be the repo name that they would Docker pull. So here's a simple Pulp 3 example. We would create a repository and a remote, and then by syncing that remote, it would generate a version. We would create a publisher, which would we would use the publisher with the generated version and get a publication. We would then create a distribution associated with that publication, which would expose it as some path. And the connections here are kind of showing how they're connected in Pulp. For example, a repository and a remote have no connection. A repository and a publisher have no connection. You could kind of say that these 3 objects are the base of a repository, but they're not really connected to each other. So when looking into how we model this in Katello, we looked at all the different scenarios that Katello supports, such as creating a repository, publishing it in a content view, promoting that to a lifecycle environment, and tried to look into how we would structure that. This is sort of what I came up with which gave us a lot of flexibility. We have 2 reference tables, which are kind of like just lookup tables where we can look up what an href is and to know what that object is in Pulp. The repository reference holds the repository and the publisher hrefs. And it associates it with a content view ID and a root repository ID, and we'll kind of talk about why that is in a little bit. But that also allows us to see what's associated with a particular root repository or a content view. We also have a distribution reference, which has a path. And then, of course, the href. The path is how that publisher is exposed. And then a root repository ID, mainly to allow us to get back to see where did this actually come from, and it will allow us to clean up the distribution reference if you delete a repository. The Next thing is the repository itself. Our current model, we added fields such as a publication href, a remote href, and a version href. And we're going to see how all of these things are used. So here I've put the three tables, repository reference, distribution reference, and repository on the right. And we're going to go through scenarios and fill it in. So the first scenario is we're going to create a repository. So creating a repository in Katello creates two objects, a root repository and a repository itself. And as part of this, looking down at the bottom, we would create a repository entry. Here we get an ID of 101. The root ID, of course, is 1. Excuse me. The Pulp, or the version href, would be filled in, as well as a publication href. And for our library instance, this would be basically the latest version and publication. So if you're syncing it, we would save this information after we synced it. If you're uploading content, we would save this information after you upload content. We would then we would also need to create a repository, of course, to have a version and a publication and a publisher. Sorry, to have a version and a publication, we need a repo and a publisher. So I kind of did that in reverse. We would need to create a repository reference, which is referencing the content view and the root repo. So for a specific content view and root repo combination, there's only going to be one repo and one publisher. And again, we would use these two things and generate a version href and a publication href. We also need to expose this on the file system. So we would have a distribution reference entry where we have, in this case, I'm just using an example /repo. And the href it's available at, as well as the root repo ID. And all of these hrefs are the same, just to show that it's an href. They wouldn't obviously all be completely different. So we've created our repository. It has been published and is available for use by a client. It's currently empty, but that's okay. Next, we create a content view and publish it. And as part of the publishing, we're going to get an archive instance. As you see here, the archive instance has no lifecycle environment. The content view, I've called it My App. It has an ID of 304. So we would, obviously we've created a repository object here. So in our, sorry about that. In our repository table, we have added an entry. And then we need to create a repository reference because we're going to be doing publishes. So, and we're going to be making modifications, which is new versions. So we've created a repo as well as a publisher, and we're referencing the content view ID and the root repo ID. So future publishes are just going to reuse this content view ID, or sorry, reuse this repository reference and basically layer on versions to it. And then for this particular Katello repository, we're going to generate a version and a publication. So what this means is this archive instance is sort of backed in Pulp 3 really by a version and a publication. And from there, we can promote it to our lifecycle environment library. And as you see in Katello, that creates a repository instance. Let that fade away. All right. It creates a repository object with, here the ID is 103. Again, the root ID is 1. We don't have a version and publication href because we didn't need there's no change here. We're not generating anything as part of promotion. All we need to do is expose it to the user at some path. So in this case, we've created a distribution CV library repo with its href, and again linking it to the root repo ID. And we're going to promote that to dev, and again, just like the promotion to library, we're going to create a repo instance in our Katello repo in our table, which we've got here, a 104, where this is already being done today. And the only thing we really have to do in Pulp is create a distribution at the CV dev repo. And so this allows us to sort of keep track of everything. We can look up, what is in Pulp and create things if they're not there. And hopefully that answers some questions about how we're tracking things in Pulp. Instead of just jamming everything in the repo table, we're creating these other tables which allow us to more intelligently track at certain situations. When we need them, we can reference them. When we don't need them, we don't need to reference them. And that's it. Thank you.